Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program this evening. Again, as we speak to Professor Bolaji Akinyemi on various international events around the world. Prof, thank you for joining us again this evening. You're welcome to the program.
Thank you. Compliments of the season to you and to our comrades on the program.
Thank you, sir. Same to you, sir. Um, Prof, the world continues to be greeted with the news of increases in infections and deaths of COVID-19. And we touched on this point a little bit last week, Prof, and you expressed some uh, concerns last week. But given some of the news coming out recently, over the last few days, about more reactions to the vaccine, are you more concerned this week than you were last week?
Um, well, the answer is maybe yes. The answer is yes, I am. Um, and the cause of my concern is I don't want a setback in the acceptability of the vaccine. Um, I'm speaking as a layman. I'm convinced that COVID-19 exists. I'm convinced that we haven't got on top of COVID-19. I'm convinced that it is still going to wreak more havoc on the world before we checkmate it. And the only thing we have going for us is the vaccine. And I don't like this one step forward, two steps backwards in the way we are reacting to the vaccine. Uh, uh, the fact that the European countries, the EU, as a body, has not come up with a consensual position on the vaccine, even though this vaccine was made in Germany, is a source of concern. It's a source of worry to me. Um, uh, the scientists and the doctors and the medical um, people in charge of validation in the European Union just taking their time. Are there things they have seen which we have not seen, which is making them to be hesitant about coming forward, which does not help the cause of vaccine? Because those in England and in the United States who are anti-vaccine are going to be pointing to European Union. Say, well, you made this vaccine in Germany, and yet the European Union itself has not validated it. Is there something they know that we don't know? Or is it just uh, the European validating bodies being tagged in what they're doing? Let them actually tell us why are they hesitating. I think it has got to the stage now where they should tell us we are hesitating because of A, Y, Z, or we are not hesitating, we are waiting for one more country to sign on, or that kind of thing. And so that's why I'm concerned that the lack of symmetry in the way the vaccine issue is being handled is fueling the anti-vaccinistas.
One thing we have seen this week, Prof, is this issue of another strain. The British Health Secretary raised this earlier on this week, being seen in the United Kingdom, and other countries are also citing this same thing. What are your views on that?
It's all part of the package of worrisome developments. Um, it adds to one more question as to why people are getting worried or about whether they should take the vaccine jab or not. If there's a new variant, is the vaccine going to address the new variant? Is the new variant so different from the old one that we may need a new variant of the vaccine to address this? Or will it be able to, will the vaccine also be able to cope with, with the new variant? Um, I listened to one doctor say there's no cause for alarm, that the reason why every year people take the flu shot uh, at the beginning of the flu season is in a way to deal with new variants of the flu, and that therefore there should be no panic. But when there are too many issues, um, it just plays into the hands of those who probably feel maybe we've rushed into this into this validation of the vaccine, and it doesn't help matters when, just because it is Christmas season, a government relaxes the rules, relaxes the quarantine regulations, just because it is Christmas, not because things are getting better. In fact, things are not getting better, whether in the United States or in UK or in Europe. Things are not getting better. So why is it that just because it is Christmas, you are relaxing the rules? Are you not going to relax the rules when it is the Islamic festival time? Are you going to relax the rules for Hanukkah? Uh, I mean, at times I don't understand people who make the rules, and perhaps one sympathy is then with a confused public, a confused body of citizenry who simply says government is not leveling with us. And this just adds to the total confusion, both about the virus and about the vaccine itself.
Prof, there's a development that we've had this week. For the first time, we've seen a national leader pass away from the vaccine. Where should our national leaders draw the line between national interests and being accused of being too cavalier about their own health?
Well, I assume you're talking about the Prime Minister of Swaziland,
Yes,
who died
yes.
of COVID-19. We have had, again in Africa, one ex-head of state who also died of COVID-19 complications, and that's Jerry Rawlings of Ghana. Now, today we've had a deluge of European presidents, prime ministers, and heads of state who have had to go into quarantine because they've been exposed to an active COVID-19 infectant. And that's Macron. Macron has been diagnosed now as having the COVID-19 infection. It had bothered me as one had watched the various conferences of the European Union at the head of states level. And even though they were wearing masks, but they were not obeying the physical distance measure. And it's like, again, part of what we are talking about. Is this thing as serious as we are being made to believe if the presidents and prime ministers and heads of states are going to be this cavalier in holding conferences? At least one continent we can appreciate in the way in which they've done it has been Africa. There have been summits of the African Union. There have been summits of the ECOWAS heads of states, all held by Zoom, virtually, not face-to-face meeting. And you then kind of wonder, why are we in Africa taking it more seriously than European heads of states? We've got to simply accept that there is something now which we have to call COVID-19 diplomacy. Even the United Nations this year did not have its regular face-to-face General Assembly meeting. So the European leaders might have done themselves some harm and done the rest of the world some harm as well in the way in which they have continued business as usual. So maybe now that Macron is down, several of the prime ministers and presidents have had to now take cover and quarantine themselves. Maybe they themselves will now stop having these face-to-face conferences and adopt the COVID-19 diplomacy, which is diplomacy through Zoom conferences. And this may also help the message they are getting across to their people and to the rest of the world that COVID-19 is real, that there is a second wave of it coming around, that the second wave may be even more virulent than the first wave, and that people are dying from even this second wave. So maybe that would be at least, if one could talk about a silver lining to a terrible catastrophe.
Prof, there's one question I want to put to you here while still on COVID-19, and it's the news that Bahrain approved a vaccine from China. Is this a win for China in the race to have a country like Bahrain endorse what they have done as well?
Obviously, for a country outside the Chinese sphere of influence to adopt the Chinese vaccine, it's a positive win for Chinese soft diplomacy. You will recall that Bahrain was one of those who had entered into agreement with Israel, embracing the Abrahamic doctrine. Now, Israel had adopted the Pfizer vaccine, and now Bahrain has adopted the Chinese vaccine. So what does this tell us? Maybe that even though Bahrain is becoming or has become a diplomatic ally of Israel, it still maintains considerable degree of autonomy in the way and manner it pursues its foreign policy.
Excellent. Now, while we're talking about Bahrain and Middle East, this year marks the 10th year anniversary of the Arab Spring. That uprising that started when Muhammad Bouazizi set himself on fire and subsequently died of his injuries. Um, Prof, 10 years on, what are your views on the uprising at that time?
What's being called the Arab Spring, uh, which some Arab and non-Arab scholars have actually are starting to call the Arab tragedy, simply, it's one of those subjects that if you are teaching in the classroom, you can use to illustrate the conundrum between democracy and development, something we've talked about on this program a couple of months ago. Now, I think the only country in the Middle East that has benefited in terms of its freedoms had been Tunisia itself, where it all started, in the sense that they got rid of a dictatorship, they have a functioning democracy, a plural democracy, and some form of stability. However, democracy has not brought economic progress to Tunisia. On the contrary, I think that economically, Tunisia is worse off now than it was under the dictatorship. In other Arab countries, it brought disaster to Libya, which had been forced to replace the dictatorship but prosperity of Gaddafi with basically a failed state, with all that goes along with economic disasters in Libya. In Egypt, what have you had? They've replaced one dictatorship with another dictatorship. Went through an interregnum of, well, multi-party diplomacy, but I wouldn't call the period of the Islamic Brotherhood democracy by any means. So what has Egypt benefited by just exchanging or rotation of dictatorships? Economically, the Arab Spring hasn't brought any economic boom to Egypt. Then you have Syria. the Arab Spring brought disaster to Syria. You had a civil war that practically tore that country to pieces. You didn't manage to get rid of the dictatorship that is still in power. You probably have now more foreign interference in the affairs of, or more foreign presence in the affairs of Syria. Obviously, there's a greater Israeli presence, Iranian presence, Russian presence. Who else that you have there? All sorts of foreign players, Turkish presence, all in Syria now, and the economic situation in Syria leaves nothing to be desired. And that's why I said that actually Arab scholars and non-Arab scholars also are calling the Arab Spring, well, an Arab winter really. So it's been disastrous for that whole belt. So I'm not surprised if scholars in that area are raising the question of what did we really gain from having what they've called Arab Spring, apart from Tunisia itself. But as I've pointed out, the spring in Tunisia has not brought economic prosperity to Tunisia, but it has brought democracy.
Prof, while still on that point, um, what should they have done different for them to achieve the gains that people wanted over that time? Because yes, they succeeded in toppling the leaders, but what could they have done differently once they had that gain at that point?
Quite a difficult question to answer, and yet a very pertinent question. What you needed was for the Arab Spring to have brought one, a change of government from autocratic ones to democratic ones, but not overnight. You see, because having a change of ideology and a change of a system overnight brings instability of its own. Not that I have an answer of how do you get a transition, a gradual change from dictatorship, keep stability, and then have bring in economic benefits, and then end up with a fully democratic government. How do you maintain that transition? I don't know. Two, how do you keep out foreign interlopers? Like what happened in Libya. There were too many foreign interlopers who pretended they were acting in Libyan interests, whereas frankly, they wanted to just get rid of Gaddafi. They had no post-Gaddafi blueprint, and they had no commitment to staying in there and ensuring stability after Gaddafi was gone. They just came there to get rid of Gaddafi. And once they got him assassinated, their interest was finished. And of course, there are other actors who are again just waiting for them to do that before they will then come in. The jihadists, the various secessionist movements in Libya, different with different agenda. And yet, once you have different movements with different agendas being manipulated by external forces, how can you have stability? And how can you have economic progress? So I really don't know whether this kind of thing is possible. I really don't know. Unless you are going to replace one dictatorship with another, as happened in Russia after the monarchy was overthrown, and then the communists came in. You had the Communist Party, and then you had the communist government, and of course they then had uh, then you had an economic program that called for sacrifice. It didn't bring economic prosperity immediately. It didn't. It never does. It calls for sacrifice by the people. And this is why, you see, it's often impossible to have a functioning democracy replacing uh, um, um, replacing a dictatorship, an autocracy, and yet bringing in economic development, because you are going to be asking people to make sacrifices, and people don't like making sacrifices if they have free elections, as one of the things they won after after the spring, because they want immediate economic comfort. If they are going to have economic dysfunctionalities, then they will vote out they will vote out the present government and bring in a new government. That's what democracy is all about. And yet, that new government may itself not have an economic blueprint. Can you really have an economic blueprint that will not entail economic sacrifices by the people? It takes time for measures that you put in to start to yield results. 2 years, 3 years, but during those 2 or 3 years, there will be economic hardship, and economic hardship and democracy don't go hand in hand.
Thank you for that, Prof. Um, just a quick message to our viewers. Please feel free to send your questions in and your comments on the different platforms we're on, and I will pass those on to Prof. But Prof, moving on now to an issue that seems to be building is the issue of the United States and the International Criminal Court. Now, earlier in September, the United States had imposed some sanctions on some leaders of the International Criminal Court, primarily the chief prosecutor. Um, what are your views on using sanctions in that sort of way?
It's the theory is that each country is sovereignly equal, whether uh, at the United Nations or several of the specialized agencies of the United Nations. But the reality, of course, is that we are not all equal. And even in the animal kingdom, uh, animals who go around tweeting the tail of a mouse will think twice or thrice before tweaking the tail of an elephant. I mean, the tail of a lion. They will think twice. And within the United Nations itself, they have brought in this mechanism of the veto power in the Security Council, which prevents actions targeting the superpowers, which the United Nations as a body will lack the capability to enforce. People have said that the veto power protects the superpowers. My argument is that the veto power protects the United Nations from actually making an ass of itself. Because without the veto power, you could end up in a situation where the United Nations decides to impose economic sanctions against a superpower and nobody goes along with you because of the power of the superpower itself to defend and protect itself, and if necessary, to go to war to do that. Now, the International Court of Justice and the ICC, they don't have that kind of provisions. And I do understand why the Prosecutor General of the ICC decided that she will investigate the behavior of American armed forces in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Legally, she could, but does it make sense to try? Simply because to even make the ICC effective, you need the cooperation of the United States, along with other big powers, to make the ICC effective. So I sympathize with her. She wanted to protect the integrity of the ICC by demonstrating that on moral grounds alone, the ICC should go after any country whose soldiers or airmen or naval men violate the tenets of international law in terms of the behavior of its military. I understand that because already the ICC was being criticized as going after only African countries. So she felt the integrity of the ICC has to be protected by going after misbehavior in Iraq and Afghanistan by the United States. But whether that made sense or not, we are just seeing it. Accounts of the ICC itself are in Western banks, and the United States has shown that it has the capability through the Department of Treasury in Washington to make life difficult, not only for the officers of the ICC, but for ICC itself, because most banks in the world go through American banks in Washington or in New York in carrying out their activities. The European banks found that out in Iran when the United States decided to leave the Iranian pact, but at the same time threatened that any European country that does business with Iran will face sanctions. Again, only the United States could have done that because of the volume of economic activities that it carries out and how other countries use American banking system to do that. So with Biden coming in, I can assure you that Biden administration is not going to put itself in any position where in 2 years or in 4 years' time, the Republicans will come back and say, you promised to protect American troops. Instead, you exposed American troops to trial by ICC. So while the Biden administration may look for ways of removing the sanctions against the ICC personnel, don't expect the Biden administration to give full-throated support to the ICC in its investigation of American troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. It won't do so. It's like, again, what we're talking about in terms of democracy. American voters will not support any administration which exposes itself to accusation that it didn't back up American troops. After all, you sent them into the field. You are the one who sent them there and haven't got there. They're doing their job the best way they know how. And you're exposing them and telling the ICC that they can investigate them, they can arrest them, they can even prosecute them. In terms of democracy, that political party will be heading for defeat at the polls.
Thanks for that, Prof. A question here, while still on the subject of sanctions and the United States. The United States has sanctioned Turkey for buying Russian military equipment. How do you respond to that? Are you surprised by that move from the United States?
Um, I I don't think it's a question of whether that I understand where they are coming from. I can see the American administration has been very opposed to Turkey buying Russian equipment because it goes against the strain of its membership of NATO. If you allow one to get away with that, what's going to happen next? Will another member of NATO now start to buy weapons from China? Will it just be a question of buying weapons from them? Supposing Russia now says it wants to buy a used Turkey NATO equipment. Will Turkey say no when Russia has been prepared to sell equipment to Turkey? And yet, wants to start the slippery slope of sanctions by the US against Turkey. Where will it stop? And I think this is why even Trump held back But unfortunately, this was an action by Congress under a law put in place specifically to address an issue like this. And in Congress, they were able to get a veto-proof resolution calling on the United States, calling on the administration to impose sanctions on Turkey. The majority votes were such that Trump could not have vetoed it. But again, that it will come at the tail end of Trump's administration simply creates another trouble for the incoming Biden-Harris administration. This is just another pitfall, foreign policy pitfall that they're going to inherit in, is it 3 weeks, 4 weeks time?
Yeah. All right, Prof. Another question coming here for you, which is the issue of the cyber attacks in the United States. And this one has been regarded as a very special one because of the length of time it had been going on since March. Some government agencies have been targeted. Investigators have said other organizations and other governments may have also been targeted by this same cyber attack. Are we starting to see a crack in the US armor in this new frontier of cyber warfare?
Well, we've had First World War, we had Second World War, we had the Cold War, now we're having cyber war. We've been told what the Americans have discovered, the Russians have been doing, and as you said in your introduction, since March. We haven't been told what the Americans have been doing fishing in Russian cyberspace. We haven't been told what Russia has done in Europe, and we haven't been told what the Chinese have been up to and what the Americans have been up to in Chinese cyberspace. So what we can say for definite is that we've gone now into another phase of warfare amongst the superpowers. My fear is what happens if interference with this cyberspace goes inadvertently and triggers off, the signals on atomic weapons. Can an atomic missile be triggered off inadvertently by interfering with these signals? Can interference with this cyber space affect the supply of electricity to hospitals, to critical equipment in hospitals, in labs dealing with manufacture of virus, manufacture of bacteria under military control, and thereby inadvertently release virus or bacteria into the atmosphere because the control mechanism, which depends on supply of electricity, has been tampered with through this cyber warfare, all sorts of things. There are so many satellites, military and civilian, out there in space who depend on this regular supply of information control, maintenance, and depend upon signals from the earth to it and back. While conducting this cyberspace warfare, could something be interfered with and brings these satellites cracking down to the earth? It's what I know for certain is probably that's going to be the next phase of multilateralism, that there will be a conference where all of them are going to sit around the table and come up with regulations that will draw parameters for engaging in cyber warfare. That's probably going to be the next activity of the United Nations.
This week, the Electoral College has spoken. We've seen them they voted for President-elect Joe Biden. Prof, how did you react to that news when you heard that the votes had gone to Biden?
Sigh of relief, a huge sigh of relief, because till the very end of that process, Trump was still making calls to Republican public officials, putting pressure on them, threatening them, persuading them to upturn the votes cast for Biden and transfer them to his own column. And by the time they were getting to that stage, there had been violence on the streets of the United States. I wonder about this as far back as November 4, right after the elections. I warned against violence spilling onto the streets of the United States. So it is a huge sigh of relief that so far, so good, the system has worked. But the system had been under enormous pressure. And we should just keep a self-relief that the system didn't crack, that human beings, honorable men and women running those systems, stood firm, even though they know this may cost them their electoral posts at the next election if Trump decides to go after them by asking Republican voters not to vote for, say, these governors and these secretaries of state who are Republicans and who didn't play ball with him. But he still has one more card to play. And that is when Congress itself meets on, I think it is this December, or could it be January?
6th of January?
4th of January, did you say?
6th.
Or maybe it's January, because all these votes from the Electoral College have now to be passed to the Congress, and the Congress must now vote to adopt the votes from the Electoral College. And he is going to try to put pressure on Republican members of Congress to vote against votes coming from the Electoral College. That's the final stage. And I mean, he's a poker player. Until the last card is dealt, a poker player doesn't get up from the table and admit that he's been defeated. So there is one more mountain to climb, one more river to
to
cross.
cross.
And let us hope the system holds firm until that time.
One more question on the election in the US is where we see a lot of some senior members from the Republican Party are starting to speak up. Some are starting to leave the party on the basis that they're citing Trump's desire to overturn the election. Is this too late in the day for them to be doing such? And have they damaged democracy beyond repair?
No, I mean, two questions I've asked there. The first question is, I don't, to me, it's very, very late in the day. I have more respect for those Republican elected officials who have stood firm. I have more respect for the judges, including the judges appointed by Trump, federal judges who have stood firm. I have more respect for them than for the clowns in the House of Representatives or in the Senate, who all of a sudden their eyes are now opened. The first simply is that they lacked the moral courage to stand up and oppose one man who was trying to bring the American house down on the heads of everybody. They lack the guts. I have no respect for them at all. And that they are not just coming round. To me, they should earn no credit and definitely not Mitch McConnell. I think he's a disgraceful specimen of an American politician. Uh, but they've done it, they've done it. Has this damaged democracy beyond control? Democracy is probably a pretty tough bird when it comes to governance. It's been around for quite a long time in one form or the other. It hasn't always been at its best. They said they had democracy in some countries during the times of slavery. They still said they had democracy during Jim Crow laws in the United States. I mean, look at the gap between 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was signed in the United States, and yet slavery was maintained. Women were not given the right to vote. And then gradually. So it will suffer some body blows, but I think it will survive. I think it will survive. Um, I'm pretty sure of that. But that is not to say that what has happened in the United States has not created some ripple, if negative ripple effects in Africa. For example, they've just had elections conducted in Ghana, and there have been several democratic elections in Ghana in the past decade or so. First time that I'm aware of when the defeated candidate, instead of being honorable, has refused to accept the result of the election, has refused to congratulate the presumed winner of the election, and there have been violent demonstrations on the streets of Accra in Ghana, unheard of, unheard of. And I can trace a direct correlation to what's happened in the United States. You've also had violent demonstrations on the streets of Côte d'Ivoire, in Abidjan. You've had violent demonstrations on the streets of Guinea, all post-election manifestations. And I trace this to Trumpism in those countries. So while I will still claim that democracy is pretty solid and will survive Trump, it's not without some negative manifestations of Trumpism in other parts of the world.
Well, Prof, we have about 2 minutes to go, and I have a final question for you. How are you spending Christmas? Have you selected your Christmas turkey yet?
Well, first of all, my doctor has said no more meat. So it's not going to be turkey. I've got to look for some lobsters and king prawns that will replace that. That I will just join the rest of the world in saying Merry Christmas to our Christian friends. Happy Hanukkah to our Jewish friends. Happy whatever you are celebrating, whether it's New Yam Festival or Kwanzaa, whatever it is, have a happy, happy holiday.
Prof, thank you so much as we come to the end of the program, and also the end of this season as we take a break next week, Thursday, and the Thursday after, so we can dissect that turkey properly. So there'll be no program next Thursday and the Thursday after, but the 7th of January, we'll be back. We'll be dealing with more issues that would have occurred in that time span. And I'm sure that Prof would have rested a lot and be ready and cracking to go in the new year. So thank you very much, Prof. 29 sessions it makes today. Very insightful throughout this period. The comments have been amazing from our viewers, both before, after, and during the program. The program has been viewed and is being viewed in almost 16, 17, 18 countries. Not looked at the stats lately, but thank you to all our viewers who have stayed with us through this period. 7th of January 21, we will be back on the program. We will be taking more questions, and Prof would be here. So thank you to our viewers. We appreciate you. Prof, any final greetings before we close the program this evening?
Happy, blessed season.
Thank you, Prof. And thanks to our viewers. Happy New Year to you in advance. Merry Christmas. See you next year.